She looked at me like I was everything, and I believed her, the way her eyes lit up when I spoke, the way she hung on every word like I was some kind of savior. I thought she saw me, the real me. But now, years later, sitting alone in my quiet little house in North Carolina, I realized something. I was never me in her eyes. I was just a character in a story she was writing, a story where she was the lead, and I was whatever she needed me to be. Carl Jung once wrote that women often fall in love, not with a man, but with the idea of a man, a projection, a fantasy. And if I'm being honest, I felt it early on. I remember one Thanksgiving. Her eyes went cold. No reason, no fight, just distance. She was there, but she wasn't. Like she'd suddenly remembered I wasn't the man in her script. That night, I sat in the garage with a cold beer, staring at the concrete and thinking, what did I do wrong? But the truth is, I didn't do anything wrong. I just stopped playing the part. She didn't change the story. She just swapped out the actor. And that, gentlemen, is the warning Jung left us with. Not in the tone of a guru trying to hype you up, but like a man who's spent decades in the trenches of the soul, telling you the truth no one else dares say. You think you're being chosen, but you're just being cast. And when you no longer fit the fantasy, you're replaced. You know what I used to believe? That being chosen meant something, that when a woman picked you out of all the men in the world, it was because she saw something real in you, something solid, something true. But I've come to learn something else, something quieter but more honest. She didn't choose me. She chose an idea of me. Let me explain. Years ago, I met Susan at a friend's retirement barbecue in Tennessee. She laughed at all my stories, said I had a quiet strength. We started dating. At first, it felt like we'd known each other forever, but about 6 months in, something shifted. Subtle things. She started finishing my sentences, but they weren't the words I would have used. She bought me a denim shirt because it felt like me, even though I hadn't worn denim since high school. And one day she said, "I love how spiritual you are." I'm not. Not really. That's when I realized she wasn't loving me. She was loving a version of me she'd built in her mind. Carl Jung called this phenomenon projection, when someone unconsciously paints their inner hopes, dreams, and wounds onto another person. We think we're connecting, but really we're acting, rehearsing lines we never agreed to. I remember sitting at her dining table one evening. She was across from me, talking about our future, and I just sat there, nodding, sipping my coffee from that old Route 66 mug she bought me. But inside, I felt invisible, because the man she was talking to, this calm, philosophical, poetic guy, wasn't me. And here's what Jung warned. When the fantasy fades, the actor gets replaced. Not the script, never the script. That's why so many men are left confused. One day she looks at you like you're her forever, and the next she pulls away without a word. It wasn't about what you did. It was about who you stopped being in her movie. The hardest part? We don't notice it until it's too late. So here's the lesson I wish someone had told me back then. If someone loves you for who they imagine you might be, not for who you already are, don't get flattered. Get cautious. Real love sees clearly. Fantasy blinds, and when you mistake fantasy for connection, you end up playing a role you can't sustain. That's what happened to me. I tried to hold the part. I adjusted, smiled more, talked less, tried to fit. But one morning I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. It was in that moment I started asking a deeper question. Not about her, but about myself. Why do I keep falling into these roles? Why do I keep chasing her love at the cost of my own identity? And that, my friend, is the doorway to something Carl Jung called the animus, not hers, yours, hers too, sure. But let's not skip ahead just yet, because what comes next will explain why some women aren't just projecting. They're at war with you, with themselves, and with the very idea of being loved. There was a day, I'll never forget it, when I was standing in the kitchen, washing dishes after a simple Tuesday dinner. The house was quiet. She was upstairs, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It felt heavy, like something unspoken was hanging in the air. And then she came down. No hello, no smile, just a look, cold, sharp. She stood there and said, "You always think you're right." I remember blinking, not knowing where that came from. We hadn't even had a conversation. I asked gently, "What do you mean?" She said, "You just always have this calm, like you think you're above it all, like you don't feel anything." That night, I slept in the guest room. It took me months, maybe years, to understand what really happened in that moment, because it wasn't just about me. It wasn't even really about the dishes or the tone of my voice or anything I did. It was about a war happening inside her. Carl Jung called it the animus, the masculine side of a woman's psyche. Just like we men carry an inner feminine, the anima, women carry an inner masculine force. And when it's immature, undeveloped, or wounded, it doesn't sit quietly. It fights. That voice she heard in her head, that wasn't mine. It was his, the inner critic, the false authority, the shadow version of masculinity inside her that speaks with certainty but lacks understanding. Jung said, when a woman's animus goes unexamined, it becomes a tyrant. It doesn't just whisper thoughts. It dominates, it moralizes, it argues for the sake of arguing, it builds walls instead of bridges. And when a man like you or me shows up, quiet, calm, consistent, something in her rejects it, not because we did anything wrong, but because our presence triggers the inner war she's been avoiding. We become the canvas she paints her inner conflict on. So she pushes, she challenges, she provokes. And when we respond with reason or stillness, she interprets it as superiority, distance, or emotional neglect. It's not fair, it's not easy, and it's not always obvious. But here's where it gets even harder. Most men don't see it coming. We take the blame. We try to fix it. We think, maybe I am too quiet. Maybe I should explain more. Maybe I need to soften, bend, accommodate. And just like that, we get pulled into her inner battle, not as a partner, but as a soldier in a war we didn't start. One man I met in a men's group in Ohio told me something that stuck. It's like she needed me to be the villain, just so she could keep fighting something. And when I refused to play that role, she got angrier, like I was breaking her script. That's the animus. That's what happens when a woman hasn't reconciled with her own inner masculine energy. But before we get too righteous here, let me say this. Men have their own projections. We fall for the damsel, the goddess, the girl who needs saving. And when she turns out to be human, we get bitter, distant, cold. So this isn't about blame. This is about waking up, understanding that sometimes the war you're fighting in your relationship isn't about love at all. It's about two people projecting their inner battles onto each other, calling it romance. And that, my friend, leads us to the real heartbreak. Not when she betrays you, but when you betray yourself just to keep her love. Let's talk about that next. There's a kind of betrayal that doesn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It comes quietly, like the moment you find yourself smiling through something that hurts, or saying, "It's fine," when deep down, it's anything but. I remember, one Saturday morning, she asked me to cancel my fishing trip to help her sister move. I said, sure, even though I'd been planning that trip with my buddies for months. She didn't even thank me. Later that night, I sat in the garage again, staring at that same old toolbox my father gave me the year I turned 40. It hit me hard. When did I start saying yes to everything that made me smaller? That's the kind of betrayal I'm talking about, not betrayal of her trust, but betrayal of myself. See, most men, especially good men, are raised to protect, provide, and persevere. We bend so the people we love don't break. We sacrifice. We stay calm. We stay steady. But somewhere along the line, that quiet strength turns into silent surrender. We stop speaking up. We start editing ourselves. We become easy to live with. And then one day, we look in the mirror and can't find the man we used to be. Carl Jung said, "You don't become a man by being chosen. You become a man by choosing yourself." I didn't understand that at first. I thought being a man meant being wanted, needed, depended on. I thought if I could just love her better, work harder, be more agreeable, she'd stay. But no matter how much I gave, it was never enough, because she wasn't in love with me. She was in love with the part I was playing, and I was good at it. I played the church husband, the retirement companion, the steady, reliable rock. But inside, I was crumbling. Every yes I said to her when I wanted to say no was a crack in my own foundation. Every time I smiled instead of speaking my truth, I chipped away at my soul. And here's what I've come to realize. Something I wish someone had told me earlier. When you betray yourself to keep someone, you teach them how to abandon you. They stop seeing you as a man with boundaries. They start seeing you as a utility. And worst of all, you start believing that your value depends on being useful, agreeable, selfless. But brother, I want to tell you something I had to learn the hard way. You are not valuable because you sacrifice. You are valuable because you exist. With a voice, a will, a center. And if you've lost that center trying to be loved, it's time to get it back. That path back isn't easy. It's not about getting her back, or proving anything, or winning. It's about turning inward and asking the question most men are afraid to face: who am I when I'm not performing for love? That question is the gateway to a deeper journey, the kind of journey Jung spent his whole life mapping, a path that doesn't lead back to her, but back to you. It's called individuation. It's not soft, it's not pretty, but it's the only road that leads to freedom. And in the next part, I'll take you there with me. After she left, I didn't rush to date again, didn't hit the gym, didn't buy a motorcycle, didn't download those apps my nephew keeps telling me about. I just sat with myself. At first, it felt like drowning in still water. No one to ask what I wanted for dinner. No one to fill the silence between commercials. No one to check in and say, "You okay?" But slowly, that silence became something else. Not loneliness. Space. Space to hear my own thoughts. Space to feel without apologizing. Space to ask questions I'd been avoiding for years. One night, I was at a gas station just outside Flagstaff. Middle of nowhere. Cold wind, quiet lot. I bought a coffee and sat in the car for an hour, not because I was tired, but because something inside me had cracked wide open. I realized I had spent most of my life being who other people needed me to be. The good husband, the fixer, the solid one, the man who never makes a scene, but under all of that was me, a man I barely knew. Carl Jung called this journey individuation. It's not therapy. It's not self-improvement. It's a rebirth. It's where you stop asking what the world expects of you and start asking what your soul has been whispering all along. And let me tell you, it's not pretty. It's nights where you cry without knowing why. It's looking in the mirror and realizing you've been gone for decades. It's facing truths no one claps for because it's not performative. It's private, quiet, brutal. Started journaling. Not the neat kind, just scribbles. Words spilled out like something that had waited too long to be heard. I wrote that I was tired of pretending to be okay when I wasn't. I confessed that I missed what it felt like to be respected, not just relied on. I admitted I crave peace now, not another performance to keep the house calm. And most of all, I whispered a truth I had never dared say aloud. I no longer want to be needed in that old, heavy way. I want to be known, seen, without the mask, without the role, just as I am. There were moments I wanted to run back, call her, say I was sorry, even when I wasn't, just to escape the ache of solitude. But something deeper held me, not pride, not stubbornness, clarity, you. See, when you start the journey back to yourself, everything fake begins to fall away. You stop over-explaining, you stop over-giving, you stop negotiating your worth just to be accepted, and you start standing, slowly, shakily at first, in the strength of your own presence. It's a quiet kind of power, one the world doesn't celebrate, but it's the only kind that lasts. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That line hit me like a brick, because I spent decades thinking I was just unlucky in love. But really, I had handed over the pen. I let someone else write my story while I played along in silence. Individuation is when you take the pen back, not to write a fantasy, but to tell the truth about who you are, what you want, what you'll never tolerate again, and when that man shows up, whole, weathered, but grounded, everything changes, because women may like charm, but what they trust is wholeness. And when you no longer need to be chosen, when you no longer shapeshift to avoid abandonment, you become untouchable. Not because you're distant, but because you're real, and that, my friend, is where the world starts to whisper, "Be careful, that man can't be controlled." Not long after I started living differently, quieter, firmer, more rooted, something unexpected began to happen. People got uncomfortable around me. Old friends who used to call every weekend stopped reaching out. Women I met through church or community groups would tell me I seemed hard to read or a little distant. One even told me, "You don't seem like you need anyone." And she said it like it was a bad thing. At first I questioned myself. Maybe I'd gone too far. Maybe I'd become cold. But deep down, I knew the truth. I hadn't become cold. I'd just stopped being pliable. See, the man who has done the work, who has burned through his illusions, who no longer performs, no longer begs, no longer bends, isn't easy to control. And that kind of man, he's terrifying, not because he's cruel, not because he's aggressive, but because he can't be shaped. Carl Jung warned us, society doesn't know what to do with a man who has become whole. He's too still, too solid, too awake. He doesn't chase, doesn't cling, doesn't crumble under emotional games. And because of that, people who live in illusion will label him all kinds of things. They'll say he's emotionally unavailable, when what they really mean is, he won't play the part I assigned him. They'll say he's arrogant, because he won't apologize for knowing who he is. They'll say he's too serious, when the truth is, they've never seen a man who refuses to laugh at his own pain just to make others comfortable. You see, the individuated man doesn't perform for belonging. He belongs to himself, and that's what makes him so rare. He walks into a room and doesn't need to dominate it. He just is. His presence is felt, not loud, not boastful, but steady. He listens. More than he speaks. He doesn't explain himself to earn approval. He doesn't flinch when misunderstood. Because he knows being misunderstood is often the price of being real. Remember sitting across from a woman at a small-town diner in South Carolina. She looked at me and said, "You're hard to get close to." And I replied, "Maybe, or maybe I'm just not interested in being consumed." She didn't know what to say after that. Most people don't, because the world is used to men who are eager to please, but they pause when they meet one who is finally whole. Here's the paradox. Once you stop trying to be loved, once you stop bending yourself into shapes for affection, that's when people start feeling drawn to you, and it terrifies them, because you're not chasing, because you're not explaining, because you no longer need anything from them, which means they can't control the outcome. That's when they realize you're no longer a character in their story. You've stepped off the stage, you've stopped rehearsing, and you've become the one thing the world can't easily digest. Man who lives from within. In the next breath, I'll tell you something even more powerful. That kind of man, he's finally ready for real love, not fantasy, not projection, not performance, but truth. Let's talk about what that love really looks like. Real love didn't come to me wrapped in fireworks. It came in a quiet moment, one I almost missed. I was walking through a farmer's market in Oregon. Crisp morning air, smell of apples and roasted peanuts. A woman, probably mid-50s, stood next to me holding a basket of plums. She looked over and said, "These are best when you stop expecting them to be perfect." She wasn't talking about the fruit. We talked for 15 minutes, no flirting, no performance, just presence. She didn't ask me what I did for a living, didn't ask if I was seeing someone. She just saw me, and I saw her. That was the first time. In years I felt like a man, not a project, not a savior, not a role. Carl Jung said, love does not consist in gazing at each other, but in looking outward together in the same direction. And I believe him now, because real love isn't about finding someone to complete you. That idea that someone else will fix the ache inside you, it's a lie most of us were sold when we were young. Real love begins after you've faced yourself. After you've stood in your own shadow and made peace with what you saw. Only then are you ready to meet someone who doesn't need saving, doesn't want molding, and doesn't flinch at your honesty. You stop looking for a fantasy and you begin looking for truth. And let me tell you what truth looks like. It's not glamorous. It's the woman who listens without interrupting, who tells you, "I don't agree, but I still respect you." Who doesn't try to finish your sentences or rewrite your story. It's the woman who has done her own work, who sat in her own pain and didn't run from it. She won't fall in love with your potential. She'll fall in love with your presence. She won't idolize you or romanticize you. She'll meet you here. Now with both feet on the ground. No masks, no tests, no neediness, just truth. And here's the deeper truth. Most people never say out loud, real love is work. Not the exhausting, shape-shifting kind, but the kind that demands honesty. The kind that requires you to choose every day to stay awake in the relationship, to listen, to speak plainly, to grow. And when you've done the work on yourself, that kind of effort doesn't feel like a burden. It feels like honor. Because now, you're not giving from emptiness. You're offering something real. The healed man doesn't seek validation. He offers stability. He offers presence. And he knows how to receive love without fear that it might disappear. That's what real love is. Not a performance, not a prize, but two whole people, standing side by side, not leaning on illusion. In the final part, I want to ask you something that might change how you see everything you've lived through. Because the real question was never, will she love me? It was always, will I choose myself, even if she doesn't? Have you ever felt like just a character in someone else's story? Like no matter how much you gave, your loyalty, your patience, your quiet strength, you were still just replaceable? If you have, I want you to know something. You are not alone. There are thousands of men out there, sitting in silent living rooms, lying awake next to someone who stopped seeing them, or driving through long back roads, wondering where they lost themselves. And maybe, just maybe, one of them is reading this with you right now. So here's a simple question I'd like you to answer right here in the comments. When was the moment you realized you were playing a role, not being loved for who you truly are? Your story matters. Your voice matters, and someone out there needs to hear it, to know he's not the only one waking up from the illusion. Tag a brother who needs to hear this. Forward it to someone who's been quiet for too long, because sometimes one brave comment can break a lifetime of silence. I used to think being chosen was the finish line, that if a woman picked me, stayed with me, loved me through the storms, then I'd be okay, that I'd finally matter, that I'd finally feel like a man. But Carl Jung didn't leave us a roadmap to being loved. He left us a warning and a challenge. He warned us that the longer we live for approval, the more we vanish into projection. That as long as we crave someone else's love to define, us will keep becoming whatever they want and forget who we are. And the challenge? To choose yourself, even when no one else does. to look in the mirror and say, "This is me, and I'm still worthy," to stop chasing women who love the fantasy and start standing as the man who no longer needs to be imagined. You see, the man who chooses himself isn't arrogant, he isn't cold, he's simply free, free to love without losing himself, free to walk away without fear, free to sit alone and still feel whole. So here's my question for you as we close. What's one thing you're no longer willing to apologize for? Answer it, write it down, or better yet, share it in the comments, because the moment you stop explaining yourself is the moment you start writing your own script. You're not an option. You're not a role. You're not just somebody's memory. You are a man, fully alive, finally home.